and thank you for coming out. What I do in a talk is the talk will last 45 minutes to an hour. The first half hour, I'll talk about what is an old book, first editions. I'll show some of the things I brought, tell some stories, anecdotes of places I've been, people I've seen, a little bit of my background also. And then what I like to do is question and answer, because I can go on and on and on and on about old books. And at least with question and answer, I can go on about what you want to listen to. The last minute or two of the talk, I'll appraise one or two books from the audience to the whole audience in detail. After that, I'll end the formal part of the talk, so anyone who wants to go can go. But I'll stay, I'll answer any and all questions, I'll do any and all appraisals. I'll just do it a lot more quickly so we can get out of here tonight. I guess the first thing that comes up when you talk about old books is, what is an old book? And usually people mean by that, what's a valuable old book? Well, the first printed book was in 1456, the Gutenberg Bible. If any of you have a Gutenberg Bible, let me assure you that it's valuable. Matter of fact, the last time one sold, half of it went for $5.5 million. Single pages sell between $50,000 and $100,000 on average, and some even more. But any book printed in the 1400s has value. Some more than others, but anything in the 1400s. After that, it depends on what the book is. You can have a book printed in the 1500s that was a relatively dull and uninteresting book then, and it's still a relatively dull and an interesting book now, and nobody cares or will pay anything much for it. On the other hand, there are some recent books. The first edition of the first Harry Potter book, which in England, which is only a little over 20 years old, has sold for up to $80,000. So it's all what people are looking for and what you want. And I get loads of calls, and people will say, I have an old book, and I know it's an old book, and the way I know it's old is the pages are all brown and crumbling. I point out that's more lousy paper than it is how old the book is. But this is a page from a book that I'm going to pass around. Some of the things that I show off tonight, they're small. I'm not going to pass them around. They'll be up here at the end. But you'll see this isn't terribly fragile. The paper's white, the ink's black. This was one of the first books ever done with illustrations. It was printed in the 1490s. So this page is a little over 500 years old. And you sort of say to yourself, well, gee, if they could make books like that then, why don't they do it now? Well, there was a big disadvantage to a book like that. First of all, in the 1490s, you had to be quite wealthy to get an education, to learn how to read. You had to be almost nobility to be able to afford to buy a book like that. Nowadays, maybe the books aren't quite as well made, but they're at a price that can be distributed in the millions. And the real value of books is the knowledge in the books and the dissemination of that knowledge, and I think it's a very good trade-off. Inevitably, when you talk about book collecting, somebody will come up and say, I have a first edition. How much is it worth? And I point out that most first editions never came out in a second edition, probably never should have come out in a first edition. Nobody wants them, cares about them, or would pay anything whatsoever. A book has to be historically, scientifically, literarily, or for some other reason important that there's a group of collectors out there who want it. And usually when you think of first editions, you think of literature. Dickens, Twain, Faulkner, Fitzgerald, Hemingway, and so on. And even within that, there are a lot of things that can make a big difference in the price. The condition being one of the most important. The paper dust jacket on a 20th century book can make all the difference in the world. My father had a copy of William Faulkner's second book called Mosquitoes. Absolutely pristine. And the time he got it, he sold it within a week for $750. At the exact same time, another book dealer had the same book, Mosquitoes, Faulkner, first edition. It didn't have the paper jacket and had a few tiny little nicks and bumps, nothing terrible. It took them a year to sell it at $50. Because a lot of collecting is prestige. It's being able to say, look what I have. I have the best. I have the most wonderful. Essentially, I have what you don't have, And people who can afford it will pay absolute top price for the very, very best, but might not consider spending anything at all for something even slightly less. Other things that can affect the value, signed by the author. Well, once again, if the author is unknown, unheard of, the fact that it's signed doesn't mean that much. Maybe one of your relatives wrote a book of poetry, had 50 copies, signed it, gave it to family members. It means an awful lot to your family, but it doesn't necessarily add much to the price. On the other hand, if it's signed by someone famous, maybe Ernest Hemingway, that could add hundreds, if not thousands of dollars to the value. In almost any type of collecting that you get into, there are nuances that add or subtract to the value, and I use signed books to show that off a little. There are some authors that are almost impossible to get their signature. J.D. Salinger, for instance, who wrote Catcher in the Rye. He lived in New Hampshire, he was reclusive, he didn't appear in public, and other than to a very close personal friend, absolutely would not sign a book. Thus his signature adds thousands of dollars to the value. You just can't get them. Now, once in a while, this is a little aside, but once in a while people ask me, is there anything that someone maybe brought in that you would have loved to have bought, but you, for one reason or other, you just couldn't, sort of the one that got away. Well, one day a man came in, he was friends of J.D. Salinger, and he had a whole stack of letters. And they were quite valuable, but there was one letter in particular that I liked. He had just moved up to New Hampshire, he was having his house built, and he was looking back on that building, and he said a bunch of high school kids helped build the foundation of the house. And then on the sort of side, he said, and one of those kids was a pretty good athlete, that kid Carlton Fisk. So Carlton Fisk helped build J.D. Salinger's house, and I think that letter belongs in the Baseball Hall of Fame, but maybe someday. Then there are some authors that sign a lot of their books. There was a New England author who wrote wonderful ghost, sea, buried treasure, pirate stories of the New England coast. His name was Edward Rowe Snow. Now, he was a friend of my father, and I knew him. And I remember one day he came into our store, and he told us he had just been on Cape Cod. And he'd gone into a bookstore there that Snow had never been in before. He went right up to the section where his books were, pulled one off the shelf, opened it up, and exclaimed, "My, a rare, unsigned copy." And then he took out a pen and signed it, and then he introduced himself to the owner of the store. So books signed by Edward Rowe Snow don't add as much to the value. My father had a copy of F. Scott Fitzgerald's classic, The Great Gatsby. Now, it was a first edition, but just opposite what I was saying before, it didn't have the paper jacket. It was well worn and read, but when you opened it up, it was inscribed to the greatest living poet, T.S. Eliot, sincerely F. Scott Fitzgerald. And in addition to that inscription, when T.S. Eliot read the book, he made marginal notes, annotations, comments, crossed things out, added things in to just about every page of the book. That book now would be worth $200,000, $300,000, maybe even $400,000 because of the association. One last story about autographs. There was an autograph manuscript dealer in New England. He was one of the most prominent in the world at the time. But when he was a young boy, he used to collect books by Robert Frost. And he knew Robert Frost. And when he was 13 years old, he went to London, and he bought a copy of Frost's first book called A Boy's Will. Very complicated, what really is the first edition. He paid a lot of money for it at the time, came back to New England. A few weeks later, he met with Frost. He was very proud of himself. He said, "Look what I've got." And Frost looked at it and said, "What did you pay for it?" And he told him, and Frost said, "Give me the book." Frost opened it up, and the front two end papers wrote a 2-page description of how to tell the first binding from the second binding, from the third binding, from the fourth, how they change bindings, why they change bindings, the different colors of the bindings, on and on and on for 2 pages, signed it, closed the book, handed it back to the boy, and said, "Now it's worth what you paid for it." In any case, let me digress a little and give you a little bit of my background and the history of the Brattle Bookshop. The history of the Brattle Bookshop goes back to the 1820s, but for all practical purposes, It was going out of business in 1949. My father was getting married. My mother had $500. With that, they bought half interest in the store. And my father built it on his great love of books, his hard work, his knowledge, and he was a bit of a character and a showman. And we've had 7 different locations over the years, mainly due to urban renewal. And every time we'd move, when it was planned, my father would move the best books to the new location, and then he'd run sales. Half price, dollar, 50-cent, quarter, dime. Last day of the sale, though, everything was free. And he would literally have hundreds of people line up with bags, packs, satchels, whatever. He'd ring a big bell. They'd go charging into the store, grab whatever they could grab. 5 minutes later, he'd ring the bell again. That group would leave. The next group would go in. And he gave away over 250,000 books that way. Now, the last time he did this was in 1969. And we were moving from the end of Washington Street to West Street, where we are now. Now, we've always been in Boston. People are in Harvard Square on Brattle Street saying, "Where are you?" We tell them we're downtown. When my parents first bought the store, it was on a little side street in what was Scully Square called Brattle Street. To make it even more confusing, the street doesn't even exist anymore. It's where Boston City Hall Plaza is now. But in any case, in '69, we were moving from the end of Washington Street to West Street. And at the end of the giveaway, there were books left over. And like I said, my father was a bit of a character and a showman. And if you can sort of picture this, he hired a covered wagon with a cowboy and a horse team. And on the cover of the covered wagon, it said, "Go West, book lovers. Go 5 West Street, Brattle Bookshop." And they filled it up with books, and they drove it from the end of Washington Street near Boston City Hall, up Court Street, down Tremont by the Boston Common, to where West Street is, and then back down Washington Street with my father sitting in back, throwing books out the whole way. Now, the superintendent in charge of traffic was a friend of his, told him he could do it all morning, but within an hour, the city was in an absolute standstill. They told him to stop. He didn't care. He'd gotten his point across. And we've been on West Street since then. When we first moved in, we were at a 150-year-old, 5-story wooden building, absolutely crammed full of books. On February 1st in 1980, I got a call at 4 o'clock in the morning. The building was on fire, and it literally burnt to the ground. I mean, it was 100% gone. And we wanted to keep going, not go out of business. We found a storefront a few doors up the street. We rented folding tables. People either sold, gave us, donated books. Kevin White, who was the mayor at the time, came down with a carload of books. And even though it was a meager stock, within a month we reopened. The main thing was keep going, continue. Over the next 4 years, we slowly but surely rebuilt the stock. 4 years after that, we bought the building we're in now, which is, again, a few doors down on West Street. And it's sort of the old Dickensian type of store. Outside stands at $1, 3 and 5, 2 floors of general used books, and then a 3rd floor with rare books, autographs, manuscripts, first editions, leather bindings, and so on. And that type of business, the large, old, general, secondhand bookstore, is a dying business, especially in the inner cities. And the reason it's dying isn't that people don't like books, buy books, read books, sell books, but in the cities, property value has gone so high, that rent has gone so high, that old bookstores, which I can assure you are not the most efficiently run businesses in the world, one right after the other have been going out of business. And in the last few years, the internet has just speeded that process along. Now, like I say, we bought our building in the early 80s, so I hope to be doing this for years to come. I have daughters who are in their early 30s. I don't think they have any intention of coming into the business like I did. And I've done this all my life. My parents say my first word was book. I don't know. I'm sure they were talking about books all the time. Maybe it was. And I worked after school in elementary school, junior high school, summers during college. I have a degree in chemistry from the University of Massachusetts. I was going to get a doctoral degree at the University of Wisconsin, but in 1973, I needed a year off. My father's health wasn't that good. That year now has been a little over 40 years, and I don't regret for a minute that I'm doing this and not in a laboratory somewhere.
Can I ask a question? I'm always very curious. You have that empty space outside where you can look at books there. Do you pay as much for that space as you do for the building, like in property taxes? It just is surprising to me that you can keep that space. I love it. And I'm
Okay,
hoping it stays.
what she's saying is the empty space
Yeah.
that we have, and every day when it's not raining or snowing, there are a few thousand books out there that are $1, $3, and $5, and right next to the building. That's where the store burnt down.
Oh.
That's why we have that.
Okay.
And we happened to buy the building next door to it because we knew the owner when they were moving.
Yeah.
So the property tax is a lot. It's not quite as much as a building and land, but the reality is what's valuable is the land, not the business, not the building, not the and I know what I'm doing with books. I have no clue what to do on developing. That's probably the one thing that my daughters will be very interested in when and if I ever retire, but I've decided that I'm going to live forever because I like what I do and I'm never going to retire.
Yeah.
But that's why that can be there.
Yeah.
The reality is there were 2 or 3 stories about bookstores in New York. One's the Strand, one Argosy, huge used secondhand bookstores. In the last paragraph, and this would apply to us too, the last paragraph in each of the magazine articles said they own the property and essentially the property subsidizes the business because you could probably sell the property, put the money in the bank and make more money that way, but that wouldn't be fun. And I don't know what I'd do. And just keep me healthy and it will be there. In any case, one of the things, and I know this is small, but if you would ask me what's one thing I wish I could find, it's a little pamphlet here called Tamerlane by a Bostonian, done in 1827. Although it doesn't look like very much, the Bostonian who did this was Edgar Allan Poe. It's his first book. It's a classic rarity in American literature. And the first copy to ever really be found was in the 1890s on a bookseller's 10-cent table. Another book dealer spotted that they bought a stack of books so it wouldn't stand out, and in 1890 sold it for $1,000. Then in the 1950s, there were 2 postmen in the New Bedford area who were book scouts on the side. And being postmen, they knew where all the library and all the yard sales, bought a trunk of books, bottom of the trunk, Tamerlane. Families got involved, they got to negotiating. After 6 months, they sold it for $10,000. Now, I don't know if it was worth it because they started out best of friends. By the time they sold it, they never spoke again. But they got their $10,000. Then about 20 years ago, there was an antique dealer in the Newburyport area who died. His whole estate was auctioned. Paintings, prints, furniture, antiques, books as a group, $600 to an antique dealer in New Hampshire. They put all the pamphlets in a box, $15 each. Someone, of course, picked out a Tamerlane, and about 20 years ago sold it for $198,000. And about 3 or 4 years ago, one sold for $800,000. And let me just say, this is a facsimile. A lot of what I bring with me are original. I don't bring million-dollar pamphlets. But if any of you want to take a close look and then go home and check your attic cellars, basements, whatever, if you find one, please give me a call. I'd love to hear about it. A lot of the fun of collecting is learning about something, is studying it, is appreciating it. It's really your knowledge that makes something interesting and thus valuable. Someone might look at something and say, oh, that's a scrap of paper. Someone else might say that's a broadside that led to the Boston Tea Party, that led to the American Revolution, that led to our country's independence. So it's really that knowledge and understanding that makes things valuable. Now, here's an item that on the surface I think is interesting. The story behind it I think is even more so. This is on White House stationery. It's dated April 11th, 1933, and it starts, Dear Jim, I want to send you this note to tell you how happy I am that you are to represent the United States in Poland. It's the most important post, etc., signed always sincerely, Franklin Roosevelt, and it's to the Honorable James Michael Curley, Mayor of Boston. Now, on the surface, this seems like a great honor. It's an ambassadorial appointment. Well, Curley didn't think it was such an honor. Matter of fact, I think he thought Roosevelt was trying to get rid of him, which of course he probably was. And Curley's response to Roosevelt was, remember, this was 1933, he said, in Poland, with Germany on one side, Russia on the other, You should send your worst Republican enemy to Poland. He said, matter of fact, if you think it's so important, why don't you quit and go there yourself? Now, Curley's opinion of Washington didn't change over the years. We also have about 10 letters he wrote when he was in Danbury prison. Now, even though these were personal letters, it was still very much the politician. And there was one quote I particularly liked. He had just gotten into prison, and he wrote to his wife, and he said, "Many of the four-legged creatures in my cell have more honor than the two-legged creatures in Washington." In any case, enough for Curley and that. We also get lots of things in, letters, documents, brochures, paper items. Here's a program from the 1912 World Series. Red Sox played the Giants. Red Sox won the World Series in 1912, won a few more times in the teens, and then we had to wait a long, long time. Who knows what this year will bring. But not only is it interesting as a baseball item, but there's an ad on the back for Arrow shirts and collars. Collars are $2 for $1, shirts are $1.50 and $2. A little more expensive nowadays. It's also become very popular to go on cruises and cruise ships. Now I have a brochure here for a ship, tells you how wonderfully built, where to book passage, and anyone who wants to go on the Titanic. This is an original brochure, and almost anything you can think of, there are people out there who are interested. There are whole societies of Titanic historians who do nothing but study the Titanic. There's also a tendency, whenever you talk about collecting, that all of a sudden everything seems to be worth thousands, hundreds of thousands, millions of dollars. And I like to point out, not everything has to be high priced to be fun. Old Life magazines, for instance. Here's one with Errol Flynn on the cover. Another with Elizabeth Taylor when she was 15 years old.
What year were those?
These were in the 40s, 30s. And they don't sell for very much. There are millions of them. And a dollar or two here or there, but not a high price. We used to have by a stairway on a wall, we used to have a few hundred of the more famous lives that we hung there. And people would sometimes stop and stare at that wall, half an hour, at a time, just lost in thought and memory. They loved them for the stories, the articles, the photographs, made wonderful birthday or anniversary presents if you fell on the right dates. And then one day we had a regular customer come in, and he bought about 50 Life magazines from World War II. And it wasn't what he normally bought. So I asked him, "Why are you buying these?" And he said, "Well, I want to teach my children about World War II." And he thought a nice way to do it would be to get some of the old Lives, look at a few of the photos, read an article or two, and then discuss it with his children. Sounded like a good idea to me, but I was a little skeptical. In any case, he came in a few weeks later. I said to him, "How's it going with the Lives?" He said, "Fabulously," but not the way I thought. He says the kids don't care about the stories, the articles, the photographs, but they love the ads. And he says, and it turns out by looking at and discussing the ads with them, he could probably teach them more about what the United States was like during World War II than if they had done everything else anyways. I have a cookbook here from the 1700s. Some of the recipes are wonderful. And then you have How to Bake Eels the Common Way. I don't know if I want to bake them anyway, but that's beside the point. One of the most interesting parts about the business for me is going out to houses and estates. That's how we get most of our books. It's almost like being Jim Hawkins on Treasure Island every day, never knowing who you're going to see, what the books, the people, the places. And I'll relate a few of those stories to you, and then maybe we'll see about some questions. This was a while ago. I was out of the store. I got back that there was a message that a Mrs. Fisher had called and had some books. I called her up. She said, "Oh yes, my father died in Providence. He has 500 art reference books. We want to get the best price we can. We're inviting a number of dealers down to bid on them. Would you be interested?" Well, 500 art reference books sounds like a good library. Providence is only an hour away, and we go a lot further than that. So we went down. They lived on an old street called Benefit Street up near Brown University. Got to the house. It was a large old colonial house. Got led through the house into a courtyard, into a garage. Second floor of the garage, they had 5,000 books. Well, it turned out her married name was Fisher. Her father's name was John Nicholas Brown. Family founded Brown University, one of the wealthier families in the country. And after about 6 months, I bought about 80% of the books I wanted. I was pleased. She was happy. And she said, my mother has a lot of books. Most are being given to the university. Some are being sold at auction. But would you like to go to Newport to take a look at the books there? Well, their house in Newport is one of the mansions on the ocean. I mentioned this to my wife. She decided to come with me on this deal. And one of the fascinating parts about it was being in one of those mansions that was still being lived in by a family. And at one point, wandering from the basement to the attic, all on my own, without a tour guide saying, come here, go here, and just one, it was fascinating. Another time I got called to Newport to do an appraisal. Now when I come to groups like this, I do hundreds of free appraisals. Matter of fact, my goal is that whenever you think of an old book, you think of me and the Brattle Bookshop. I don't care if you think of 10 others, just as long as I'm one of the 10. We have cards here, we have 800 numbers, email, whatever. And one of the ways I feel I can do that is by giving out as much free information as reasonably possible. But there are times when people need very formal written appraisals for insurance, estate taxes, whatever. Then I discuss a fee. Any case, another mansion in Newport, not quite as big as the Browns. This was the Perry family. Commodore Perry, Oliver Hazard Perry. And what they had was a whole stack of papers from the War of 1812. During the war, their family were privateers. Well, they're privateers if you're on our side. They're pirates if you're on the other side. It's all the way you look at it. But it was the day-to-day accountings of the ships. They would sometimes capture a ship and realize tens of thousands of dollars profit. In 1812, that was an incredible amount of money. Then one day, one of the ships got into a battle. The ship got hit. The captain got hit. He lost his leg. 3 days later, there was a tiny entry at the bottom of a page, and it said, Captain, $5 bonus, loss of leg. And that was the last you heard of the captain. When my father was still alive, and he died over 30 years ago, we got a call from a lady, vague about her name, who she was, what she had, but it sounded like there might be some interesting items, books. And so we decided to go to her house. We got to her house. There was a little ranch house, paint was peeling, weeds were growing, and you sort of say, gee, what's going to be here? Anyway, she answered the door. She was quite elderly. We walk in, and there were just gorgeous antiques everywhere. I mean, really, really beautiful antiques. And she got to talking, and it turned out she was originally from the Boston area, but she had married the Prince of the Ukraine, the cousin of the Tsar of Russia, who had escaped just before the revolution. And she told story after story about being Russian nobility in Europe, all the court intrigues, all the goings-on, how T.E. Shaw used to stay at their house all the time, how she didn't think he accidentally died on a motorcycle, but there was a lot more to it. T.E. Shaw, of course, was Lawrence of Arabia. And she went on and on and on with these wonderful stories. Turned out her books were lousy, but the stories were absolutely wonderful. And when we first got into the house, on one of her walls, she had 10 watercolors. They were probably this size, pastoral European scenes. And when I first saw them, I thought they were nice. And the longer she talked and the more I looked at them, the nicer I thought they were. And I finally said to her, those 10 watercolors, they're really nice. And she sort of turned around and said, oh yes, they're all Turners. So she had 10 original Turner watercolors on her wall, probably $1 million worth of paintings. And it was like, oh yeah, they're all Turners. So you never know what you're going to see, the people, the places, the characters. And matter of fact, speaking of characters, about it's more like 15 years ago, we went to one of our customers' 100th birthday parties. Now, when you go to a man's 100th birthday party, and he tells you he just got back from Barcelona, he's going to give a talk in Florida, and he's been asked to lecture in Tokyo. And I finally said to him, wait a minute, you're 100 years old. Don't you think Tokyo is an awfully long way to go? And he said, well, when I used to work, it took me well over 25 hours to get to Chicago. He says, I don't think Tokyo's a whole lot further than that nowadays. And here's a man who can tell you about one day sitting down to dinner with Henry Ford and Thomas Edison. Now, he was a young man at the time. He said he was excited about this dinner, all the learning and insight he was going to get from these two men. He got to the table a little bit early. He said 5 minutes later, Ford came in and sat down next to him. And about 15 minutes later, Edison came in. Now, Edison was elderly, had one of those big horns for hearing, sat down opposite, and he said the first thing, Ford turned to Edison and yelled, "My Tom, you look very good." And Edison turned to Ford and yelled, "It's the Carter's little liver pills." This man said all night long, all they did was yell about Carter's little liver pills. And he said next time he wanted to learn something, he went to the library. Anyways, I can go on with these stories. I'll tell one more and then see about questions. We get hundreds of phone calls at the store. People wanting to know, do you have a book? Can you get a book? How hard is it to get the book? Does the book exist? Or how much is it worth? What's the value? And so on. Most of those questions, either I or the people I work with, we can answer off the top of our head. Some are a little more involved. Occasionally, you really have to do some research, but that can be fun. But every once in a while, you get a call that really stands out. And again, this was quite a while ago, but I answered the phone. "Hello, Brattle Bookshop, can I help you?" Lady, elderly, thick Irish brogue. And the first thing she says is, "President Kennedy slept with me." Well, you have to admit that gets your attention. She stopped and waited for it to sink in. And then she went on to explain that she had worked for the Kennedy family. She had been his nursemaid. When he was 3 and 4 years old, he used to fall asleep in her arms. So he did sleep with her, but not what you first think. And what she had was a whole series of handwritten letters from the president. Now, presidential letters of any type have value. Handwritten letters, particularly from later 20th century presidents, are scarce, rare, and valuable. She wanted to get an offer on them. I was skeptical about that, but I thought she'd be fun to meet. I went to her house. Great stories. Letters were fabulous. I gave her what I thought was a tremendous offer, much as I suspected, though. There was no way she could sell these letters. Letters were part of her life. I left a note behind. As far as I know, her family still has them, probably where they belong. Maybe someday, who knows. Like I say, I can go on and on, but why don't I see if there are some questions? And quite honestly, anything you ask me, I can go off on a tangent. Did you, way in the back?
I'm curious, are you a collector yourself?
The question is,
Yeah.
that's the question?
Are you a collector yourself?
Yeah, the question is, am I a collector myself? Yes and no. There's one collection we have that I'll talk about at the very end of the talk. My wife used to collect books on jazz, and she had over 1,000 books, signed photos and all of that. She decided a few years ago to sell the collection. She was afraid that many of the people that she considered important, 10, 20 years from now, the younger people have no idea who they were, so it was probably better. What I collect now, when I grew up, my father used to bring home 3 or 4 books a day. Do that for 30 or 40 years. He always meant to read an introduction, a chapter, the book, the dust jacket. But, I mean, there were just heaps and piles. I read a lot, but I tend to read them and then bring them back and sell them. What I actually collect is stories. I literally have page after page after page of 1 or 2 lines of this story, that story, so that when I'm looking back on things, or if I'm doing a talk or I can just pull up the stories. I actually do a podcast now called Brattlecast, and I tell a lot of those stories. You can get it on iTunes and all that. Subscribe. We'd like to get the numbers up, but Brattlecast. But so I sort of, every time something interesting happens at the store, I jot down a line or two, and I have page after page of that. And everybody says, write a book. I don't write well, but I can tell stories really well. So I go for that. So in a sense, and like I say, there is one collection that I sort of tell near the end of the talk. Yes?
If you have a very old book that the binding is in horrible, terrible shape, does it detract a lot from the value if you have it rebound?
Well, the question is,
stay together.
The question is, if you have an old book, the condition isn't good, does it detract from the value if you repair it, fix it, and so on? First of all, a collector always wants the book as close to the original as it is in the best condition they can get. So, obviously, mint, perfect. If you have a book that's in the original, but it's very, very fragile, never do anything to it. Maybe have a box made. That can be very simple, or it can be, jewel encrusted leather. But the book's inside the box. If you have a book that's damaged, there are two ways to decide whether to fix it, monetarily and sentimentally. If you're going to get something fixed properly, you have to take it to a restorer, a bookbinder, and so on. It's expensive. They have to earn a living. They have to pay the rent. They have to pay taxes. They have to send their kids to college and buy groceries. It's not cheap. If you have a $5 book, you put a $500 repair. When you're done, you still have a $5 book. Now, if you have a $5,000 book and, you know, a few $100 repair or something, that actually might make sense. But that's more a monetary decision. And again, you'd prefer not to have to do anything, but that's... The other way of evaluating it is, if you have a book that's been handed down generation to generation to generation, then if you're repairing it, it's not necessarily the monetary value, it's the sentimental value, and then you decide whether to do that or not. Usually, the recommendation would be to do the least you can possibly do and do it right and reversible. But, you know, then there's being practical too. Anyone else? Yes.
I know in small towns in New England, maybe this would be in the 1800s, there were lots of very small publishers. Like, I live near the town of Newport, which is north of Keene.
Yeah.
And there were publishers in Newport, and I volunteer at the library there, and we have some of the books that were published by, you know, they're little pamphlet sort of things. Is there, I mean, I find that interesting, but are those of any value?
The question is, in a lot of the towns, areas, there were publishers who, you know, well, they might have also done the newspaper in town, they might have done flyers, advertising, and did books. And there are, in any general question you ask me, yes, there could be valuable, high-priced, and so on. But in many cases, most cases, it's where a book can be very, very scarce, very, very rare, but there isn't a big demand. There isn't a large customer base, so they're not necessarily expensive. I remember when I was in college, a friend of mine lived in Greenfield, Massachusetts. Her father owned the radio station there, and he liked collecting books printed in Greenfield. There actually were a lot of books printed in Greenfield, but you know, they weren't high priced. Now, where you run into a dilemma there is, if you find one that you haven't seen before, and someone's charging more than you want to pay for it, but you might never see it again, then you just got to evaluate it that way. But yes, there are people of the local historical societies, the New Hampshire Historical Society, the local ones. Yeah, there's pride of your town. A lot of that got collected and gone together, especially in the bicentennial. And the reason it did was there was a lot of money given to local towns and communities for their local history. And some towns are better funded than others, better supported, better worked. But yes, there is a demand. And occasionally, depending on who the author is, who the printer is, and so on, they can be quite valuable. But that's the unusual ones, yeah.
I happened to catch you on Antiques Roadshow, and I'm wondering how long you'd done that, how long you'd been an appraiser, and maybe what was the best book you ever came
Well,
across?
the question is Antiques Roadshow, and I usually talk about that a little further on, but I'll do it right now. I mean, ask the question about Antiques Roadshow. I've done the Antiques Roadshow, I think, is in its 22nd or 3rd. I think we're going to be taping the 23rd season starting in April. I haven't quite gotten my assignments yet. I think they're coming out this week. But it's a lot of fun to do. I mean, it's a great way. Why would I go to Boise or Omaha or so on? But anywhere you go in this country, if you make any type of effort at all, it's beautiful and the people are friendly. Maybe avoid politics and religion, but you know, literally anywhere you go in this country, it's a gorgeous country and the people are friendly, and so that's one of the big benefits. And I'm very lucky because usually my wife and we can go out 2 or 3 days early and actually see the areas. I've done it for about 18 years. And the way that show works is they're actually changing format this year. They're going to be doing it at smaller locations like a little more like the English show where they're doing it at mansions, it'll be out some indoor, outdoor. But the way they've generally done it, it's done on a Saturday. You appraise from 7:30 in the morning, sometimes to 7:30, 8 at night. It's in a convention center, about 5,000 people come. Each person has 2 items, so there's about 10,000 items that come in. They tape for television for the center, the main, maybe about 50 appraisals, then they have the small ones, but that's out of 10,000 items. And as an appraiser, there are 3 book appraisers sitting next to the music appraisers, next to the jewelry appraisers, next to the pottery, porcelain, so on around. About 80 appraisers at a show. They don't pay us anything. They don't pay transportation. We pay it all on our own. But, well, if you think it's public television, if there are 75, 80 appraisers, even if it's $1,500 a piece, then it's 5 or 6 shows, that's $1 million. But, it's fun to do the show. It's tremendously social. We go out to dinner. There are some of the appraisers we see. So it's a lot of fun. And as far as some of the really fun things that we've seen, and of course we want to get on TV. There is no advance on anything. So you never know whether you could fly out, pay the hotel and go to a city, and if nothing really good comes in, you don't get on TV. A few of the fun things that I've had, there was a show, I don't even remember what city it was, but a woman came in and a relative of hers was in the Civil War and had a long letter, a 4-page letter, and those usually aren't that interesting. Well, some are, some aren't, but most of them aren't. He was in the hospital in Washington. And it was 4 pages just saying he had diarrhea, he was sick, hopefully getting better, and just, writing home and saying, could you write more letters? And went on and on and on for 4 pages. And then at the very end, there was a little parentheses, and it said, written by his friend Walt Whitman. So Walt Whitman had written this whole... Now, Whitman was a nurse or helped in the hospitals, and what he did is either for soldiers that were too sick, that literally physically couldn't write, or were illiterate, he would write out the letters for them. And so this was all in Walt Whitman's handwriting and so on and so forth. The other thing that happens is an ideal day at the Roadshow for an appraiser is somebody comes in at 7:30, 8 in the morning. They have something really interesting, fun, good, that they don't know everything there is to know about it. You get a producer over, they say, great, go on TV with it. 9 o'clock, you're done with the TV. The rest of the day, you just appraise, but it's easy because you've already been on TV. Whereas if you haven't appraised and it's getting to be 4:35, 6 o'clock, and you're going, am I going to get on? In any case, this was Kansas City. Man comes in, he had a few things from Pope John Paul. Nothing really great, some rosary beads, a few little signatures, nothing tremendous. But it turned out he was the pilot that flew the Pope and his entourage around the United States. And then there was a photograph of him. He was the pilot, sitting in the pilot's seat. And the Pope was literally in all his full vestments, literally reaching over the pilot's seat with one leg in the air. Usually you see the Pope with his hand out, people are kissing the ring, very full. I mean, his foot was in the air, reaching over, signing his Bible. And I'm going, this is great. He can tell stories about that. He's got the signed Bible and all that. And I said, let me see the Bible. He goes, oh, I didn't bring that. I said, can you go get it? He goes, no, it's in a safe deposit box. The bank's closed. But it's like, oh. So there are some things that I didn't. And then one other thing I'll tell about the Roadshow is there are sometimes, my wife did a few of them. She doesn't do them now. But there are sometimes, and this can happen here too, when you're doing appraisals, and people have something and they just want it to be what they want it to be, and nothing you're going to say. Anyways, a lady brought in a book, and she goes, it's signed A. Lincoln. And my wife took a look at it and said, it is signed A. Lincoln, it's just not the A. Lincoln when I want it to be. She goes, how can you tell? And she goes, well, the first clue is the book was printed in 1905. And the lady goes, so? and then my wife says, well, if I remember right, he was assassinated in 1860. She goes, you don't know what you're talking about. And, I mean, so you never know. I'll tell you what, at this point, why don't I do one or two quick appraisals? Did anyone bring a Bible? If you want, I'll do that. And did anyone bring a Victorian cloth book with a sort of very decorated cover? A very nice. And if someone didn't, I just happen to have one here. Because the reason I asked for these has more to do with stories than so on. And it also has to do with a small collection. No, it has to be a little more decorative than that.
This is a...
No, doesn't quite fit into... Sure, that will do to a point. The reason I ask for these is, first of all, let me say something about appraising. When I do appraisals at a group like this, I usually give a retail value. In other words, that price that you would pay if you came into my store or a store like mine. It is not what you would get if you're selling the book. If you're selling the book, you should expect usually about 1/3 to 2/3 retail. Now, when you're dealing with the low end, the markup might be higher just because you got to make some money. When you get to much more expensive prices, the percentages can change. A number of years ago, I had a copy of Audubon's Quadrupeds, not the birds, but the animals, but the big, huge. At the time, I paid $100,000 for it. I sold it within 2 weeks for $105,000. That's only a 5% markup, but it's $5,000. Well worth the time and effort I spent, and I pretty much had it pre-sold before I even bought it. So when you get much higher values that are going to turn over quickly, percentages can come down just because the amounts of money. Also, everything I say is subjective. In other words, the fact that I say something's worth 100 doesn't mean a colleague of mine won't say 125, and another colleague say 75. So if you have an idea of what you have, you get a price, you're happy, great. If not, get a second, third, fourth, fifth opinion. There's nothing wrong with that. In any case, the first book we have here is, well, it's actually a Little Leather Library. It's Christmas Carol, Dickens. And it came, whoops. And it came in this little box. Little Leather Library, when we do the Antiques Roadshow, there will inevitably be a group of people, 3 or 4, who bring in boxes of these Little Leather Libraries. They're wonderful. They were very popular. They sell for a few dollars. They don't get much. There are people, though, that collect books and want every copy they can get of a particular book, like Christmas Carol. I one time bought 1,500 copies of the Rubaiyat of Omar Khayyam, and it was only touching the surface of how many. So this one actually might go for $10 because someone collecting Christmas Carol will want it. Now, it came in this little box. I'm not going to put it back in right now, but a decorative box. A lot of books, and this would be one of them too, before they had dust jackets, a lot of times publishers would have very decorative covers. And dust jackets, as we know them now, probably started around World War I. It was more technology. In any case, even with the box, it's about $10. And the reason that they had decorative covers like this is the publishers figured that if the book caught your eye, better chance you'd buy it. And there are people who collect books like this just for the decorative covers. You can go to library sales, book sales, yard sales, and pick these bookstores, auctions, and pick these up very cheaply. And individually, they might not seem like that much. But graphically, as a collection, they can be quite good. And there are some that are expensive. But in any case, I have a collection like this myself that started off as a bit of a joke. One day I got a book in, it had a picture of a toilet on the cover. And the title of the book was Flushed with Pride, The Life of Thomas Crapper, Invented the Toilet. In any case, I brought it home, showed it to my wife. She took one look at it, said, we have to put this in the bathroom. So we did. Next day, I got another book, had a big eye staring out of the cover. The title was We Never Sleep. It was a history of the Pinkerton detective agency. But with a big eye staring at you, I thought, put that in the bathroom too. Now this is a little half bathroom, so there's no shower, no steam. Next thing you know, we built bookshelves. Now we have 300 or 400 of these Victorian-style illustrated books in the bathroom. People walk in, they're a little taken aback. Loads of reading material. And one of the rules of the collection is that nothing can be valuable, because every once in a while a book will fall off the shelf and you can imagine where it ends up. I like to end the talk talking about Bibles. And one of the reasons I like to do that is the Bible is the most commonly printed book of all time, always has been, probably always will be. And in most cases, when people bring them in, if they're a family Bible, I say and it's their family and it's been handed down, sentimentally they might be priceless. Monetarily, they're not worth that much. We sometimes get 5 and 10, 100, 200-year-old family Bibles a week, people asking. Now, is this family? Is this a family?
Yes.
Yeah. It's
my mother's side.
Mother's side. The binding's a little bit worn. The leather is in good shape. It's around the 1870s. I didn't look at the...
There's no cover stage.
Yeah, but it's around 1870 in that period. You can just tell from the binding. It's in fairly good shape, although it could use a little work. If we had this in the store, we'd probably price it $50 to $100, and we have lots of them. Now, it's always worth checking. I'm going to just leave this here. It's always worth checking, because there's the Gutenberg Bible, there are others, but in most cases they're not. Those big family Bibles, sort of in that period, that have the beautiful embossed gold with the clasp, they can sell $100 to $300 because they make wonderful gifts. Ministers, priests, divinity students. But have one clasp go, have one hinge go, they lose all that value. Sometimes at the beginning, middle, end, I didn't look on yours, there's family history.
It's in the middle.
Yeah, that can be invaluable not only to the family but the local historical genealogical society, but many times they just want to Xerox out that page, maybe the title page, they don't want the whole Bible. I will end on one story, and then we'll get appraisals. I was called in a number of years ago to a large old church in Boston, well over 100-year-old church. And they had a huge library, and they just wanted to know if over the years they had accumulated any valuable books. And actually, they had some pretty nice books. It was a lot of fun. At the end of the day, the priest said to me, could you come down the basement? There are a few more books. I went down the basement, looked at them. And then there was a closet. I don't know quite how big that closet is, but I'm going to assume it's not that. It's a fair-sized closet. Opened the door, and floor to ceiling, front to back, top to bottom, it was filled with thousands of old Bibles. And I looked at the priest, and I said, what is this? And he says, well, people hate to throw away a book. They feel it's sacrilegious to throw away a Bible. So what happens when a parishioner dies and the family doesn't want the Bible? They come and they present it to the church. And he says, what do? We very graciously accept it. We don't want to offend anybody. Then we go downstairs, open the door, put it in with the rest of them. And he says that we can't drive a dumpster up to the back of the church and fill it full of Bibles. That just wouldn't be right. So I use it as an example to say that if you want to give something to a charity, ask them if they want it first. If they want it and can use it, great. But if not, you're really not doing anyone a favor. Thank you. Thank you very much.